Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. One of the things I appreciate so much about this practice group is the opportunity that it offers for interpreters of many stripes to come together. While it's certainly valuable for even seasoned interpreters to come along and keep their skills sharp, a newly graduated interpreter, such as me, can arguably get even more out of these meetings. This is because opportunities for those starting out in the field can be hard to come by, which means that fledgling professionals are often unable to leave the nest. One reason for this is because of the primarily freelance nature of our work. No conference would really want to hire somebody with no experience. Now, of course, it is possible to volunteer your services, but the opportunities to do so can be sporadic, and that makes any kind of regular practice difficult. A particularly rare position is that of the interpreting internship. And today I wish to tell you about the only institution kind enough to offer me that chance, Copa Cogeca. Now, it's quite possible you won't already be familiar with this particular organisation unless you happen to have an avid interest in European agriculture. That's because Copa and Cogeca, two branches representing agricultural organisations and cooperatives, respectively, is usually working behind the scenes to try and ensure that European farmers get their voices heard and their opinions expressed. Though an exhaustive explanation of everything that the organisation does would certainly take far more time than we have available, let's just say that the majority of the organisation's activities boil down to lobbying efforts and the drafting of position papers. As an interpreter, coming into this particular professional arena, the sheer variety of the topics discussed can be dizzying. The field of agriculture is broad enough to encompass not only the expected topics of crops and livestock, you'll also soon find yourself confronted with the intricacies of trade legislation and the latest developments in biodiesel research. Suffice it to say, experiencing all of this a mere month or two after graduation was quite the baptism of fire. And yet, it would be remiss of me not to mention that it is exactly this kind of challenge which allows you to make the leap from training and practice in university to the realities of conference interpreting as a profession. Long gone are the days when a soothing German voice would describe ways to save energy at home. Instead, you find yourself faced with an irate Austrian protesting the price of fertilizer, speaking at breakneck speed. Thankfully, as with any job, practice makes perfect, and after a couple of months working with Copa Cogeca, I began to get used to the barrage of technical terms with which we had to deal on a daily basis. Interestingly, it was not necessarily the memorization of different plant and animal names which proved the greatest challenge, but rather it was learning to navigate the politics of the field. Of course, this means learning the names of various bits and pieces of legislation, but it was often trickiest to learn the dozens of different names for the different delegates. It was no use describing the exact contents of an incredibly important letter being drafted if you couldn't remember to whom it was being sent. Fortunately, this kind of vocabulary was sometimes easier to learn when you could simply recall that Mr. Jones is the delegate who always wears a particularly jazzy tie. There can be certain drawbacks to working somewhere like Copa Cogeca, however. An excellent aspect of any interpreting career is the ability to peek behind the scenes and learn how our world operates behind closed doors. But the insight into agricultural processes gained by working at Copa Cogeca can prove to be a double-edged sword. The necessary preparation that one carries out prior to a meeting regarding certain types of animal husbandry, for example, will quickly acquaint you with the less savoury realities of where our food comes from. While my brief tenure at the organisation wasn't enough to change my own eating habits, I can fully sympathise with colleagues who converted to vegetarianism after interpreting detailed descriptions of the conditions in which some animals are raised. That said, provided that you can stomach learning how the sausage is quite literally made, there are some advantages to working at Copa Cogeca for those who appreciate good food and drink. Meetings of higher-ups within the organisation are often accompanied by a free lunch for everyone involved, a benefit which is certainly appreciated by the interpreters. And perhaps it will come as little surprise to learn that often the representatives of a given field can appreciate and enjoy their own products. It is not unusual, for example, for the representatives of the wine sector to bring along a few bottles from the latest harvest for a tasting by those present. It should go without saying that it is usually wise for us to avoid indulging too much before our shift is over, but it is nonetheless a very nice way to celebrate the end of the day. Perhaps the greatest advantage of working in an institution like Copa Cogeca is the permanent presence of an interpreting team. For a profession in which we must get used to a constant whirlwind of different colleagues coming and going, there is something remarkably reassuring about the ability to work alongside a trusted team of professionals. This is of course useful from a purely practical standpoint, for it allows us to get used to one another's voices for the purposes of relay. But there is also the less tangible benefit of working as part of a group beyond a single booth, an emotional support which expresses itself in the moments of shared consolation after a particularly challenging meeting, or, as in my case, outright amazement at the skills of my colleagues, and that amazement would just motivate me to push myself further. I believe that this is something that both Copa Cogeca and this practice group have in common. By bringing together interpreters, by allowing us to break away from the sometimes solitary routine of the freelance profession, these groups and organisations offer us a chance not just to work with each other and learn from each other, they also remind us that the whole point of enabling communication through interpretation is to bring people closer to one another, because it is together that we are at our best. Thank you very much.